All right, guys, you made it. I was telling Steve before we started to record, I said, Steve, stop complaining. This, if you covered an SEC team, this is what it would be like every year. You'd have like 4 or 5 of these guys flipping back and forth.
Yeah, it was a crazy day, no doubt. I've called it the National Signing Day from Hell. I mean, for Ryan Day and his staff, they came into the day with 21 commitments that they were hoping to sign, and they ended up signing 20 of them. Jeremiah McClellan, wide receiver, national top 50 player from St. Louis, defected and went to Oregon, although that had been kind of leaning that way for a while. Then it looked good for Ohio State, and then finally it was Oregon. So, however those negotiations worked out, McClellan's going to go play for Dan Lanning at Oregon and going to play against Ohio State in the Big Ten. And yes, in fact, next year Ohio State at Oregon, so he'll get a chance, potentially to play against the team he was committed to. 2 commitments who were wavering and looked like they were gone, possibly. One of them was Edric Houston, defensive end from Buford, Georgia, one of only 2 defensive line signees in this class, along with, I think it's James Mensah or Eric Mensah from Virginia. And Houston, another national top 50 player, it was rumored was going to switch and sign with Alabama. In fact, Steve Wiltfong changed his crystal ball prediction on Tuesday night, and it seemed like he was all but gone to Alabama. So during Coach Day's press conference yesterday, he took a break about 25 minutes in, walked out of the room, and took a phone call, and it was Edric Houston was on the other line, and they had to, basically talk him into the boat at the 11th and a half hour there to get him to announce at 1 p.m. Eastern time that he was, in fact, going to sign with Ohio State. So that worked out well. And earlier in that hour, they finally got the word that Jeremiah Smith, who had committed to Ohio State in December of 2022, over a year ago, whatever it was, and he was wavering. Florida State, Miami were trying to sway him to go and stay in state. He's from Hollywood, Florida, which is on the north side of Miami there. And, they were trying to get him to stay in his home state and play there. And finally, the negotiations ended up with Ohio State landing him. He announced it at a press conference with an Ohio State hat, but never sent the letter in until about 9 or 9:30 p.m. I was getting ready to go to bed. It's close to 10 p.m. last night. And finally, Ohio State tweeted out that it had received the letter of intent finally. Usually those things happen immediately after the announcements. Somebody goes to the school office and either, emails the PDF or faxes a copy of it to the school, and that's how they get it. So, but all's well that ends well. Ryan Day talked about how the first beer would taste very good last night, and I'm sure it did. Somebody asked him what brand he drinks. He says, I don't care, cold is what he said. And that's kind of my feeling too on beer. It doesn't really matter to me as long as it's good and cold. So there you go. But that was in a nutshell, the National Signing Day from Hell. And certainly there were a lot of behind the scenes discussions that probably involved a lot of zeros that got thrown in there to get these guys to end up the way that they did.
Yeah, it all came together early in terms of like 17 of the players or so had their letters of intent in by 9:30, something along those lines. We were on the air for 7 hours yesterday. We were going to wait until Jeremiah Smith got his letter of intent, and we made the executive decision at, I think it was 4 o'clock to say, nope, we're done at that point. And that was probably one of our best decisions in doing so. Ohio State not done per se in terms of recruiting, still going after Dominic Kirks out of the state of Ohio, who's committed to Washington. unless something has changed here recently, Kirks is not signed there. Ohio State has certainly gotten in his ear and has made, there have to be some thought and decision there. And Dominic Kirks didn't have to sign yesterday. This is a signing period, so there's a couple days for here, and then he could always push it back into the traditional signing period, which starts in February. I think nationally there wasn't a ton of drama. There were flips, as there always are going to be. I think the biggest name out there, name that Ohio State was involved with, Jordan Seaton, the offensive lineman originally out of D.C., who went to IMG Academy, committed on national television to Colorado, and then immediately the news came out that he was still looking around. So it just kind of goes to show you that commitments don't necessarily mean anything. Maryland seems to be a team that has a little bit of momentum. Obviously, the proximity to Washington, D.C. I know somebody in Steve's network at 247 had put in a crystal ball for Maryland. So, we'll see there. I mean, I think Ohio State did very well in certain positions in terms of hitting its numbers and the kids that it landed. There are positions, certainly defensive line, where it came well short of the number that it needed to get to. Obviously, Dom Kirks would help there. Steve has labeled this the signing day from hell, but I will remind people that I worked for a network for a long time where our sites crashed on 2 out of 3 national signing days. Those were signing days from hell. When that happens, when you have all this information and you have nowhere to say it because your site is offline. It was a long signing day. I'm glad that we've put it behind us. Strangely enough, Ohio State plays a game in 8 days. Nobody's really talking about that. We got the portal. Lots going on still. Everybody's like, oh, you should be able to absolutely just, mail it in for a couple of days after signing day. Not the case in this instance.
No, not this time of year. I think the main thing for me, the main takeaway for me is the defensive line numbers. Just getting 2 guys, and we'll see if they get that third. But Ryan Day saying that it's not really a concern because they want 8 defensive ends and 8 defensive tackles on the roster. And the way things are sounding right now, they may get all of their juniors back, so that will help those numbers. But I still think they fell short of what they wanted. And it was interesting doing this whole 7-hour show yesterday because the tone at the first half of the show was not great. The tone for the second half of the show obviously got better with the signing of Edric Houston and the recommitment of Jeremiah Smith. So when you don't lose those guys, when you're able to hold on to those guys, and really you only lose one guy in Jeremiah McClellan, I think that's a pretty good day, and it should be treated as such. I saw somebody mention the needing depth on the offensive line. David Greenshield, they got 4 guys last year. They got 4 guys this year. My concern for the past couple of years has just been the elite left tackle has not necessarily been in there. I think they got a left tackle this year in Deontay Armstrong, who might be the only left tackle. And then you've got a bunch of right tackles and guards. So we'll see how they do with those 4 and the 4 last year. So I think the numbers are okay. You just got to be able to develop those guys. And will they have enough running backs? Obviously, they wanted 3. They got 2. With the way running backs have been injured at Ohio State the last couple of years, if they just go into the season with 4, assuming Travion Henderson is back, which we don't know for sure, him and Dallin Hayden and James Peoples and Sam Williams-Dixon, is that enough? Generally, it is. Generally, the third running back really won't get many carries at Ohio State. But, Ryan Day talking about guys that he expects to be instant impacts, being Edric Houston and James Peoples. Couldn't mention Jeremiah Smith. I would assume that we could go ahead and throw him in there as well. So we'll see how quickly all of those guys get on the field. I also thought it was interesting talking about Demarion Witten, who is a tight end, but he played receiver and quarterback at Glenville because he's such a ridiculous athlete. and played a wide receiver at the All-American game that they just had, the Army All-American game, and caught like 3 touchdowns. And so it'll be interesting to watch his development because it sounds like he's too good of a player right now to be a developmental tight end where it takes, he's probably like 210, 215 pounds right now. So it's going to take him 3 years to get where they want him to be size wise, but you don't want to go 3 years without playing him. So it'll be interesting to see how they use him over the next few years until he is what they want him to be.
Kevin, are there any guys maybe a little bit further down the board that you are a little higher on than maybe most?
There's some guys that I'm really intrigued with seeing what they are. I think one of the biggest, as the dog decides now to bark in the background, Leroy Roker, the safety out of Fort Myers. You put in his tape and you see, and I hate to make this comparison because we're talking about somebody who played the position so well for 1 year at Ohio State. You see some Malik Hooker in him. You're talking about somebody who really was a basketball player as well, was averaging like 15 and 5. If I don't have the numbers in front of me in basketball, but being 6'1", $170, that doesn't necessarily really have you stand out in basketball as much as what he could potentially do in football. I'm kind of going down the list. I really like Garrett Stover, Cade Stover's cousin. Where he really lines up, we'll kind of see at that point. He played a lot of safety in high school, had moved down to linebacker, fast type of guy. But I mean, he needs to work on his aggressiveness because he's too aggressive and overruns plays. But I think that there could be a lot there. And, I guess I'm intrigued too by Eric Mensah, the other member of the defensive line. He's listed as a defensive tackle, 6'3", 290 or so. People will just assume that, he's a 3. I mean, I think he could be, a 1. He would be nice to have in a rotation with Caden McDonald. Ohio State still running its 4-man front at this point. So, we'll see. I think there's a lot of guys that I'm really intrigued by in this class. I mean, we did capsules on all of them. So, I think I've said all the words that exist in the world about all 20 of the guys who have signed for Ohio State. I was like, oh boy, now I'm going to get on Mark's show and I'm going to have to try and find things to say that are different because I've said everything else. But it's funny what the perspective is because I've seen Ohio State listed amongst winners of National Signing Day, and Ohio State actually was -1 net in terms of what it got, 21 down to 20. But I guess everybody's considering it a win because it held on to Edric Houston. It held on to Jeremiah Smith. So, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to say that Ohio State was one of 4 or 5 national winners per se in terms of what happened. Ohio State slid from the number 2 class in the nation to the number 5, just based on other classes flipping and signing guys and moving up. But it still was a very good day compared to what it could have been.
And hasn't that been a narrative that we see most years where Ohio State's in that 2 or 3 range, and then there's a mad rush by a few teams, typically from the SEC, and maybe Ohio State drops a spot or 2 and they finish 4 or 5?
Well, the thing to remember is that Ohio State 2 weeks ago was in position to finish number 1. Ohio State still had a chance of getting Karan Jones, still had a chance of getting Amaris Williams, still had a chance of – there were more players on the board. Everybody thought that Ohio State's class could get up to 26, 27, 28 players. Ohio State is sitting at 20 right now. So – there's a perspective there, but Ohio State generally finishes top 3 nationally, top 3, top 4. I don't have the data in front of me at this point.
I'm looking at it
really well at the beginning and then kind of fizzles at the end. And it's, not normally a case of losing a bunch of kids, but those within 24 hours of signing day decisions don't normally go Ohio State's way.
Yeah, this is the fourth or fifth year in a row they're going to have a top 5 class. The only year under day that they didn't was in the transition from Meyer today for the 2019 class that ended up like 14th nationally. I think every class since then, so this is 5 in a row, is going to be top 5. And that's how you win 11 games every year, 12 games, get in the playoff, is stack one great class on top of another. Looking at the rankings, Georgia is 1 with 28 commitments and 4 5-stars. Alabama is number 2 with 25 commitments and 3 5-stars. Miami is number 3 with 27 commitments and 2 5-stars. And then there's Ohio State at number 4 with 20 commitments, 5 fewer than anybody ahead of them, and 5 5-stars, which is more than anybody else on the board as it stands right now. 5 guys that are 5-star players. And the Buckeyes just did a bang-up job, I think. And that's Jeremiah Smith, Aaron Noland, Edric Houston, Mylan Graham, and one more that I'm drawing a blank on that was also a 5-star.
Aaron Scott.
Aaron Scott, thank you, the corner from Ohio. So, yeah. To me, I'll dovetail off Mark's question. I was asked on a radio show this morning, like, if I had to like go beyond, what everyone's going to say, Jeremiah Smith and Aaron Noland, what do I like about this class? I like those 2 corners, because when you have lockdown corners, it changes everything you can do defensively. And Mark Porter from Scouting Ohio works with us, and he's been following Aaron Scott, since a freshman year. He said he was intriguing. He was 6 foot tall, and then he was 6'1", and then he was 6'2", and he says, I think he might be 6'3" as a corner, which is almost unheard of, with long arms, and could be a lockdown type guy. And then you also get Bryce West from Cleveland Glenville in this cornerback class, and you get Miles Lockhart, who they talk about could come in, probably be a 3rd type corner as the nickel corner type guy, who I watched his tape. He is not a throw-in by any means. He's a football player. He's like a national top 150 player from Arizona, and he committed at mid-year last year. So this cornerback class, for me, we had somebody on our site post, this is the crappiest, and that wasn't the word that they used, crappiest defensive class that he can recall. And yeah, Mensa and Edric Houston, and then Peyton Pierce. They only got 3 guys in the front 6, or front 7 between defensive line and linebackers, but 3 corners, 3 safeties. And, that kind of plays to what Jim Knowles wants to do, I suppose. But they do, 3 straight losses to Michigan predicated on getting trampled by the defensive line, getting trampled. Could have used some help up front.
And real quickly, before we get to any of the super chats, the 2019 class may have been lowly ranked, but that doesn't include Justin Fields and Jonah Jackson out of the transfer portal. And the lowest ranked recruit in that class is DeJuan Jones. So still a pretty good
He's in the
haul.
National Football League.
Well, he's with Cleveland.
Now, doggone it, and I wanted to say something else there. Doggone it. We're 9-5, and we're playing Houston this week to get without Stroud to get to 10-5, and could clinch a playoff spot as early as this weekend if things fall our way. And then we've got people saying, "Well, if they clinch, should they rest Flacco?" I'm like, "Do you want the 7 seed? No, keep going."
So Flacco to the rescue. Reminds me of Don Strock many years ago.
Yes.
Bernie Kosar goes down.
He rescued us once.
Yeah.
Gary Danielson played that scab game. That was big.
Back to Miles Lockhart real quick. He's a guy that is a pretty tremendous athlete. Also was running back for Basha, just doing whatever he needed to do, and comes in knowing he wants to play that nickel spot, and that's been something they recruited him to do. So I always like those guys that realize where they fit in best and they attack that. And sometimes with the nickel, everybody wants to play outside. Like everybody wants to be a left tackle. Some guys are better suited to be right guards and nickel backs. And with the way the game is going, you see first rounders get selected to play nickel all the time now.
Ohio State does have the second highest player per rating average, just behind Georgia, just ahead of Alabama. And I also noticed in this class, and I mentioned this last night and made this a topic in our Miami show, is that even though it's an impressive class, 18 3-stars. And certainly there are going to be 3-stars who turn into prominent players, but the odds say that most of them won't. They'll be fill-in players. They'll be decent starters. They'll be that type of player. And Miami with 18 and everybody else around them is in that 3 to 8 range of 3-stars. So they loaded up on that end to build up their class in sheer numbers.